To record. This is Service API's meeting for July 23. We've got a few things on the agenda, and before we get too far into this, I just want to provide a quick recap of what we discussed in office hours yesterday. Jonathan Berry had a great background on and rationale for supporting more protocols than we currently do, obviously not for V1 Alpha 1, but he presents some great use cases for additional protocols and how we might want to keep them in mind. He shared this doc in Slack and had a great bit of background yesterday as well around this. The link is in the agenda as well as Slack, so I recommend taking a look at that. I don't think this is anything we want to try and include for V1 Alpha 1, but I think it's worth at least keeping this in mind as we're thinking about implementation, making sure that we have extension points for additional protocols. And then the second thing that we spent a great deal of the meeting on was conflict resolution. This is a doc that I shared yesterday, and we still have some things that we haven't covered here. So if we have time, I may come back to this later on today, but we'll just see how the discussion goes. But with that, I think James has the first thing on the agenda, which is an issue he'd raised, and I'll hand it over to him to give a little bit more background here.
Good morning. Yeah, so this is something we have someone in VMware implementing some parts of the spec, but for different reasons, they're only implementing the L4 part. So this is using Gateway sort of as an alternative to service type load balancer. So the question was, is that, conformant? I think so, but there's not really any language in the spec that kind of, spells that out clearly. And so I wondered what people's general opinion was and whether we would need maybe some kind of capabilities or some kind of specific errors for these sorts of implementations.
Yeah, thanks for raising that issue. That's really interesting and a great point. I imagine there will be plenty of implementations that only support L4 or L7. And maybe it could be further defined as some implementations will only support a subset of protocols, whatever that happens to be. And in that case, it almost feels like we need to take our initial concept of conformance and further scope it. Like most of the same things apply around conformance, but some may be protocol specific. And if those are protocols, like some way to say that this implementation is compliant with service APIs for the following protocols. I'm not sure how far we want to go down that path, but it seems like we need to provide some way of being compliant to implementations that can't or don't want to support additional protocols. Yeah, does anyone else have thoughts on this one?
I will say that this is somewhat related to the versioning, the implementation version that we discussed a couple weeks ago, in that I feel like this is about how to communicate to the user which fields are supported and which are not, and then making that a standard part of the spec in which how that is communicated.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and perhaps. Go ahead.
Sorry, I hadn't thought of that connection at all, but that is a good point. It would be helpful to have that kind of consistent communication of this implementation supports these specific features.
Yeah. Like there are, now I know we kind of have the distinction between core features, extended features, and custom features. I'm guessing that for the core features, that's required, like just to be part of the spec. And this would probably then be for all of the extended features. Things like, weight might not make sense
Yeah.
for some cloud load balancers. A lot of them don't support it. And how is that communicated in a structured way? And it kind of goes beyond just error signaling, because error signaling is it will error out when you go to apply it, but maybe there's a way for it to, you to look at a spec to just get a spit out of which fields are supported or not by looking at a certain gateway class, or maybe the gateway class communicates that in some way. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think what we're saying is even beyond just core and extended, there are things that we have so far considered core. Like I think both HTTP route and TCP route are considered core. But I think what James is saying here is you may want to consider an implementation compliant if it only supports one of those, but just add some kind of clarification that it's compliant at a specific, for a specific protocol or layer.
Yeah, I think the concept of something being core really becomes a little bit hard to express.
It does.
Because there's plenty of implementations that only do L7, right? Lots of ingress implementations are not going to implement the L4 part of the spec. So if you say, well, you're conformant if you do L4, and you're also conformant if you just do L7, then there's not really a common subset of those two things.
I mean,
Yeah.
there is the common subset in that gateway and gateway class are common concepts that are generally consistent. But I agree that as far as routes, there's not really any overlap between the two.
Well, it's just really about the ability to communicate that what type of routes are supported, right? You have a gateway class, maybe a layer 4 gateway class that is able to communicate that it's only supported with a TCP route and not with an HTTP route. And so that's one type of support that it can communicate. Another one is the fields within those objects.
Yeah. So do we think we need something beyond our current core and extended model? Like it sounds like just that is probably insufficient. I'm not sure if we should continue on with core and extended and try to augment that with, core for L7 or something like that. Or if we need to rethink that entirely and have more nuance to compliance as a whole, or conformance. Well, this is an interesting issue, and would encourage anyone who's interested to add a comment, add their thoughts. I think this, at least having a plan here, would be very helpful as part of our V1 Alpha 1 goals. I know we have not scoped conformance into V1 Alpha 1, but I imagine that we would at least want to have some kind of concept of what would be considered conformant, even if we don't have real world tests in place to verify that as part of an initial release.
Yeah, I wonder, is there any, does anyone know of any similar precedents in any Kubernetes API, like any of the storage stuff have to deal with this kind of issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure, because so many storage classes are different in ways. Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to look into that. right. Well, I will. I'll keep that in mind. And please, if you have thoughts, go ahead and leave a comment. And if there's any prior art here, that would be great to reference as well. I wanted to move a little bit into, I guess, a continuation of PR and issue triage here. There's a couple PRs that have made it in that I think are pretty close. Oh, it looks like Damien's traffic split is closer. Okay, yes, I'll follow up with that as well. Awesome. All right, so Jeremy filed this TCP route PR, and it's gotten some great feedback so far. At the last time that I checked, it looked like there was general agreement on this, and we have an approve. I am really curious with Bowie's suggestion here. I don't know for those that have looked into this, if this type alias, like if this suggestion would make a difference to all our code gen problems. I'm not actually sure, but it'd be really cool if it did. Yeah, so that's one potential suggestion here, but that could be done as a follow-up. Jeremy, did you have any thoughts on this? It seems like it's either ready or just about ready to me.
Yeah, that's my take is that there are very good comments and we should do them in a follow-up. It feels
Okay.
ready to me.
Okay.
Like there's some of the comments need more discussion, I think, than the basics are there.
Hey Jeremy,
Okay,
with the SNI field, was that intended to be for implementing TLS pass-through in the way Sidepto mentions?
It was intended mainly for matching, which is what I think a couple other docs had kind of mentioned. But it was mainly in there because we had mentioned a few times and I wanted to start a conversation, and the feedback was, let's hold on that conversation, which I'm also good with.
Okay, yeah, I guess my feedback, I didn't necessarily intend on my comment to say like, let's not do that. I wasn't quite sure. I was trying to clarify.
Yeah, I didn't actually expect that to merge with this. I just figured it would be good to kind of call out, do we want to do that? But I know your comment was valid. Like we're already specifying that in listeners. I suppose root match, it might make sense as well, because the listener can match multiple names, right? But that should probably be left for a follow-up anyway.
Yeah, the listener can match a domain or like an any. So I think there is a case to put it there, because it would be, I think the same case that you have for having the host name on the HTTP route applies here as well.
Yeah, that was kind of my intention. I mean, if that doesn't seem too controversial, once this is in, I can make a follow-up PR to add it, and we can comment on that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Cool.
great. Well, yeah, if there's no hesitation for anyone, I'm happy to add the final LGTM and just get this one in. Okay.
Awesome. One related question: do we want like a UDP route?
Would that look? I don't know that we've discussed in detail what that would look like. Do you imagine it being very similar to TCP route?
I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
I basically think it would be an exact copy of TCP route as committed right now.
But would that forward on a per packet basis? So I mean, TCP route is matching on something, right?
Right now, but until we add SNI, right, it's only actually matching on some extension. So and UDP route could be the same, but yeah, it would be like matching doesn't. I don't know. I don't know
on an IP and a port, right?
Right.
Yeah, that probably makes sense, right? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel strongly about this one. The only little bit of hesitation I have is I know that Harry and Damian have been working towards a number of changes towards this concept of route actions, and that may result in changes being needed to not just TCP route, well, not just HTTP route, but maybe TCP route. I don't know how many of those would actually translate to UDP route, but maybe some.
My
But
my
I,
gut would be that those changes would either not apply or they would apply in the exact same way
sure,
for
yeah,
most of them. So maybe it's not too much extra effort. I'm also
yeah.
okay, like, yeah, I don't know. I'd be happy to put up a PR for that and we can you know, discuss it, or I'd be happy to wait if we think that's better as well.
I can't think of a compelling reason not to have UDP route, and it does seem remarkably similar to this.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for getting this in.
Yeah, absolutely.
The
With
next,
the UDP route, would it make sense, Jeremy, after you create the PR, maybe to post something on the mailer, just because it's a topic that hasn't been discussed, and I don't know if maybe a PR would get enough attention. That's why I maybe mentioned referencing it on the mailer, just to get maybe some input from people that wouldn't necessarily be flagged by the PR.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll do that.
yeah, great idea.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
All right, this is a PR that Bowie raised a bit ago, I guess a couple weeks ago now, around better documentation for gateway class controller specifically. And this is really just an addition to the concepts doc. It's not changing any code that I'm aware of. Yes, it is really just a docs change. I think this is in a pretty good spot, but I like Jane's suggestion here. So I don't think there's anything to do as a follow-up here other than just remind anyone if they're interested in this specific bit of copy or documentation to take a look and make sure it makes sense to them. But I think this makes sense here. And the last one is going to be a larger one, which is Damian's update around traffic splitting. I saw that you had pushed an update here, but I hadn't actually gotten a chance to take a look at it yet, Damian. Is this ready for another round of review?
It is, and just a little background for others. I mean, as you can see, this has been around for a while, and as of last week, the actions proposal was reviewed. We got feedback, and the actions proposal consists of multiple sections to it, and one of the sections was around pluralizing the forward to target. And the consensus that I walked away with the consensus that the feedback last week was that this makes sense to do. There were still some questions about other parts of the proposal. And I think, Rob, you specifically have spent time digging into this PR a few months ago and felt like it was at a good place, but then we paused it to kind of look at kind of the actions more holistically. And so what I had to do is just kind of go back. There was a bunch of merge conflicts that I fixed. And as you'll see in here, it's removing a lot of stuff because we're essentially getting rid of one of the API types, the traffic split API type. And so,
yeah.
Long story short, it'd be helpful to get some eyes on this, because I imagine that there's going to be another merge conflict here in the near future if it doesn't get merged, and it's kind of a pain in the butt to fix the merge conflicts with this one.
Yeah, you're completely right about those merge conflicts being annoying. I immediately noticed this diff. It took me a second to remember. We have a traffic split API type currently, which obviously is not an intended thing going forward. So I'm glad that you've taken the effort to remove that here. And also, it seems like this change is now, like you're saying, just pluralizing forward to and adding weight as a forward to target.
Correct. And I think right here, line 300 that you're seeing here is probably where we need the closest eyes on is, you know, specifically 313 to 315. You know, does that make sense in how we deal with if, you know, only one target ref is specified, that we ignore the weight since we really don't need the weight since it's just a single target ref, right? And if multiple target refs are specified without weight. I think there's probably one other use case where if we have multiple target refs specified, but only a portion of those target refs specify weight, what would we do with the target ref or target refs that do not have weight specified? So I didn't include that use case because I didn't want to potentially overcomplicate the PR, but maybe if we have time, that could be something worth discussing.
Would it make sense to just include a default weight value?
Yeah, that was going to be my suggestion as well.
So in the default, so the use case, let's say we've got 3 target refs and target ref 1 is a weight of 30, target ref 2 is a weight of 70. And then we say, let's say a default is 1. So the third one isn't specified and it's just 1. So it'd basically, you know, get 1% of the traffic roughly.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's fine because as long as I wouldn't want a default just to be implied with a controller implementation, but as long as we're using an actual CRD default here so that one, it's well documented, and 2, whenever they view the route, they'll see, oh, this has a weight of 1, or, you know, like, because it will actually be an attribute that is set. I think that will be relatively clear and be a little bit less confusing than something having a weight and something else not having a weight.
Yeah, and it's really nice for discoverability too, because if I add, you know, if I have 2 targets and I see that they both have weights, I can play with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. I can add that. If
okay, great.
Rob or Jeremy, if you wouldn't mind just making a note there, either in the PR at line 315, because I'd like, before pushing another commit that addresses that use case, I'd like to give others a chance to take a look as well. And
yeah,
sure,
like them not to have to go through the same feedback.
Yeah,
sure.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Great, this is exciting. I am glad to see progress on this, and I agree. I think this was the one part that I think everyone agreed on with the actions proposal we discussed last week, and so it's great to see it actually translated into implementation so quickly. So great, and I know you've been sitting on this PR for a long time, so thank you for your patience.
Yeah, no worries. Well, you know, we went through that part where it's like, hey, let's hit the pause button. Let's look at how a lot of these different actions come together. So I think that was smart that we did that. And now that, you know, we've come to consensus on this, I definitely want to get it merged, because like I said, it's kind of a pain in the butt to deal with the merge conflicts. So
yeah,
awesome. I appreciate the feedback. Like I said, I'll let it soak for about 24 hours before pushing a new commit and go from there.
okay, well, awesome. Hopefully we can get it in tomorrow then. That would be great. Okay, are there any other PRs or issues that we should cover here? I don't have anything. Yes, and I noticed, I ran into this personally as well, that CodeGen as it exists right now, I think it's specifically the proto stuff is broken when you're not inside GoPath. I think that's the real scope of this is GoPath related, right? Like if you're using Go modules and happens to still be in GoPath, it'll work. It's just if you're outside of the expected path, it won't. Something like that. Yeah, but it looks like John, you are aware of this at least.
Yeah, I briefly looked into it and I struggled to fix it. I didn't dedicate a bunch of time, but if someone does know off the top of their head, that would be useful. If not, I can dig into it some more.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one of those classic things where it works because I've been using Go so long, and well, not so long, but whatever. I just have all my stuff in GoPath that I didn't even run into it until I heard from someone else that wasn't necessarily using GoPath the same way. But yeah. So yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, I'll move on because there's a lot that we could cover in this conflict resolution, but I wanted to, just because we're ideally a month or so out from a V1 Alpha 1 release, I wanted to go back through this. This, I think we can almost safely move to completed. Traffic splitting, I think we're about to move to completed. Conflict handling, we're getting a lot of progress on, and we'll go there next. Danian, I assigned you because you had a PR around cleaning up status and conditions, but I don't know that this is really exhaustive of the status and conditions bit, and I guess this is more related to polarity. So I didn't need to volunteer you for this if you'd rather not take this on, but you just happened to get this because you were working in the vicinity of this.
Yeah, no, yeah, let me pick that back up.
Okay.
As you know, as I mentioned, I was going to focus on getting that traffic split PR back in shape. And so I'd like to, the time I do have, I'd like to make sure that gets in, which I think we're in a good space for that. So yeah, I can definitely help out with the status conditions.
Great, thanks. And I know Bowie's been doing some work around service level config, and he has a doc that we talked through in a previous meeting that I can't remember when. It looks like we haven't gotten a ton of comments on it. Oh no, we have. It just took a while to load. So yes, we should. I believe he's still working on that, but I'll ping him afterwards just to be sure. And that leaves TLS config, which I know Harry had been doing some work around. So maybe, I don't want to be too optimistic here, but maybe this could actually happen sometime in August. We'll see, but I'd like to keep on pushing towards that goal. I know Bowie has created a project board with a V1 Alpha 1 milestone, but I think we need to change the permissions so more people can actually modify that board, because it may just be him right now. But we will get this more organized, and I think we're not too far away from an initial alpha release here. But with that said, I wanted to get back into conflict resolution because it looks like we have 10-ish minutes left, and there's a lot to discuss around conflict resolution. We made it through a lot of these yesterday in office hours. Just kind of as more of a working session. I wanted to highlight some of them. We don't need to go through, we obviously don't have time to go through all of them in the final 10 minutes of this meeting. But I think there are some that could be relevant. And we have some people that weren't in office hours that I wanted to get some broader feedback from. So one of the discussion points that actually went a direction I didn't anticipate was I had thought that at least in some cases, gateway listeners both matching the same host name could result in a conflict. So if you have two different gateways and they both have listeners matching example.com, I had at least initially assumed that that would be a conflict that we would want to either consider invalid or prevent in some way. That's it. You know, I raised the point that, okay, maybe this is not as much of an issue for implementations that correspond with, you know, say a cloud load balancer, and you can just point DNS at whatever you want and it will resolve itself. Maybe. But I had thought there would still be potential conflicts elsewhere. I think it was James who mentioned, well, if you did run into this situation, it may actually be desirable to just round robin between the two gateways instead. For anyone who's interested in this or thinking about a potential implementation, does that seem like something that would be possible, or would you rather it be treated as a conflict and or prevented? I'm going to go ahead and assume that silence means that nobody thinks this should be a conflict. I will look for some broader feedback here. What I'm really trying to avoid is not treating something as a conflict that really is an issue for a certain subset of implementations. And if there are some implementations that really cannot handle this, I'd hate to not at least provide a consistent way for them to deal with this. But it may be that everyone can either can handle this in some way that is relatively consistent. A very similar concept was if you have gateway listeners within a gateway that both match a host name. And I think the option there that we thought made the most sense was actually validate uniqueness of the host name protocol and port combination. And that would, because you can obviously match the same host name if it's going to be a different port or protocol. But at least if you have the same host name protocol and port, we do want to prevent that. So adding some kind of validation around that can prevent this conflict from ever being an issue. And I should go back up. I didn't really cover the guiding principles here. But from before, we really want to prefer not to break things that are already working. And if there is a conflict that we can't prevent with validation, we want to provide a consistent experience. So even if it may not feel like the most ideal experience, as long as we can make sure it's consistent. You know, an example of something like we want to avoid is having one experience while a controller still has some concept of state, but if it gets restarted, it becomes a completely different experience. You would hate to have that happen. So just providing a consistent experience when conflicts occur. And then providing clear path, whether it's in status or whatever, some clear communication, which path has been chosen in a conflict resolution. And then probably the most standard and generic concept out there, if there is a conflict and there is one match that is more specific than the other, the more specific match should always be given precedence over less specific ones. So if you have a wildcard match of star.example.com and you have foo.example.com, foo.example.com will be given precedence. So yes, those were the guiding principles I identified. This doc, by the way, is open to not just comments, but editing. So if there are additional conflicts you think of, please add them here. If there are additional options for how we could resolve an issue, please add them to any specific issue I've identified here. Yeah, anything that you might think about here. A lot of these are relatively straightforward. I feel good with the responses we got here. One of the things that I think is going to get messy and maybe could use a little bit more discussion is if there is some portion of a route that is invalid while other routes are valid for the same gateway. And so I think we know that we always want valid routes and valid portions of routes to consider to be processed by a controller and implemented. And that follows the whole idea of prefer not to break things that are working. Where it gets messy is when things get through validation. So obviously we want to have the best validation we can possibly have because we want to surface errors as quickly as we can and not wait for them to get to, say, status or conditions or require the controller to communicate that things are invalid. But with any API like this, there are going to be some things that are valid for the API, but not valid for a specific controller or a specific implementation. And in those cases, it gets a little messy how we handle the partially valid use cases. So I've got a bit of an action item here to try and think through which portions of a route right now could fall into that category of being valid in terms of API, but maybe not for a specific implementation, and how we might handle that. But I am very open to feedback here. If anyone has ideas around what that might look like, that'd be great. Yeah, I'm trying to think. We've only got a few minutes left. Of course, I added the use case here of multiple gateways targeting the same route, which I think is valid, but we could use some better communication around that. And okay, this was a large topic that I likely don't have enough time to cover here. But I'm proposing a relatively significant change to allowed gateway namespaces. I've thought about it a lot. This was a change that I initially proposed, and now I hate it. So, you know, here we are. But allowed gateway namespaces is an attribute on gateway class that has the potential to be very, very destructive as it is implemented right now. The way it is currently spec'd is if you change which namespaces are currently allowed, what is mostly written is any gateways outside of those namespaces would immediately become invalid and should no longer be implemented. Which obviously, if you mistakenly change a selector in this case, you would end up with just a really messy situation of taking all the things down. And obviously it's really messy for an implementation to make that change. So my proposal here is to do away with this concept and make it instead something that is validated on create. So you can still limit where gateways are created with a given gateway class, but that's it. This only applies to where gateways can be created of that class. So that's something we can handle in validation. You get really good user feedback. And then admins, if they really want to clean up old resources, old gateways, they can do it intentionally and in a safe way. So they would intentionally remove gateways instead of accidentally changing allowed gateway namespaces and obliterating all their gateways unintentionally or accidentally. That's a fairly significant change though, and I would like some more eyes and feedback on this proposed change, because it is, yeah, it is significant. The more I've thought about this concept of allowed gateway namespaces, the more scared I've gotten of the potential for things to break unexpectedly. Does that sound reasonable to anyone, or like something that should be avoided?
I think your line of reasoning.
Yeah, I think that I hope my audio is okay, but that is an interesting observation. I think we were running through the deletion flow and gateway class mutation flow as well, and there were a number of tricky things here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds like this is a reasonable approach to go further with. I'll say that one of the high level things that themes I'm getting out of this is we really should have some kind of validation webhook. Some of the validation I'm proposing here is more complicated than we can get out of CRD validation. So I think we'll want to work towards some kind of shared validation logic for a validation webhook that could likely be common code in the service APIs repository to enforce this kind of more complex validation.
Rob, can we talk a little bit more about the allowed gateway namespaces?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I understand
Yeah.
what's going on. So what you're proposing is that when, let's say, we create a gateway class and we specify allowed gateway namespaces and specify the namespaces that gateways can be created, right?
Yeah.
And what we're saying is that later on, if we want to expand or reduce that list, that wouldn't be supported?
No, quite the contrary. You can change that whenever you want. It's just not going to affect existing gateways. Because right now, the really scary ramification of this attribute is changing it could invalidate a huge list of gateways. Yes. And that feels very destructive and against the concept here of prefer not to break things.
Yeah. No, it's a good use case that you've kind of uncovered here. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think that is just too destructive to allow.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, this has been very helpful feedback. Again, if you think of any other things that could potentially conflict, even if you don't have potential solutions for them, please add them to that doc. Or if you have feedback on any of the proposed solutions, or some of them that just have a few different options, would love to get some more feedback in that doc. But yeah, we are actually past time, so thanks so much to everyone for their time, and excited to see this project moving along. Have a great rest of your week.